So welcome to Buddhism 2021, which is a conversation with David Brazier, Peter Coyote, and Paul Shippee. My name is Richard Laubly, and we're going to start just with some brief introductions and then jump into it. So Paul Shippee was a student of the Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi and later of the Tibetan teacher Trungpa Rinpoche. He has a master's in psychology and was one of the founding teachers of Naropa Institute. He has been the director of the Crestone Solar School since 1974, designing solar and natural buildings. He also worked intensively with Marshall Rosenberg, the founder of Nonviolent Communication, and has been teaching and facilitating NVC groups for the past 14 years, working on uncovering the link between Buddhist meditation practice and nonviolent communication. He lives in Colorado. David Brazier is an author and psychotherapist known for his writings on psychotherapy and Buddhism. He started Buddhist practice with Trungpa Rinpoche and then went on to study Zen with Jigyu Khenot Roshi and then Thich Nhat Hanh. For the past 20 years, he has been practicing in the Pure Land Buddhist tradition. He has founded a number of engaged Buddhist projects in the UK, India, and Bosnia, and is the founder of the Amida Order, from which he retired at the end of 2020. He now leads the Global Sangha. Brazier describes himself as a Buddhist priest, psychotherapist, social worker, and poet. Among his dozen books are The Feeling Buddha, Zen Therapy, Authentic Life, and a commentary on Dogen's Genjo Koan. He is an editor of the Oxford Handbook of Meditation, 2021, and he now lives in France. Peter Coyote is an actor, author, and voiceover artist who is also a transmitted Zen teacher in the Soto lineage of Suzuki Roshi. Among his books are The Rain Man's Third Cure, a memoir, his recently published first book of poetry, The Tongue of the Crow, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Meet Buddha, Masks, Meditation, and Improvised Play to Induce Liberated States, which is coming out in December. He's also working on a book called Vernacular Zen, based on a series of online Dharma talks he gave during the pandemic. He was a founding member of the Diggers and spent 8 years running the California Arts Council, and now lives in Northern California. So, gentlemen, the first question. In the 1960s, the initial attraction to a lot of spiritual practices may well have involved the exotic nature of various Chinese, Tibetan, Japanese, and Vietnamese forms. Today, the bookends seem spread much farther apart, and there seems to be a real trend towards secularism. If you think that's correct, why do you think that is?
Well, Suzuki Roshi one time said to us that we have to be careful about the shrine. We don't want to take down what's there from Japan so quickly and put something like maybe a big fish there to worship or some other thing. So that's a non-secular statement, appealing to the tradition of Buddhism and maybe even Zen. But I think that people have found the need to improvise like Americans want to do.
Well, I've had this feeling for a long time that there's the gift of the Buddha, and which was created in the midst of a Hindu culture, and it wrapped itself in a certain amount of Hindu gift wrapping to be passable, even though he took radical steps away from it. And in every country that Buddhism visited, it wrapped itself in the gift wrapping that would make it comprehensible to that culture. And my feeling after 8 years being around a pretty orthodox monastic practice, American practice at San Francisco Zen Center, was that the Japanese gift wrapping, while it brought us many things for which I'm grateful, we also tended to inhale the authoritarianism and hierarchy of Japanese culture. And I began to think that Buddhism would always be considered, sorry, a foreign exotic. Just a minute. I don't know how to do that. Buddhism would always be considered a foreign exotic. That's my phone, which I can't turn off exactly. Anyway, Buddhism would always be considered a foreign exotic until it became truly Americanized. And so my work of late has been to loosen the gift wrapping so that Americans could see it and explain it in much the way that David and Paul do, in secular terms and ordinary terms with the minimum of Sanskrit and Pali and the like.
Well, I don't want to interrupt, but I just remember one outstanding example besides what Suzuki Roshi said, which is not necessarily in favor of secularism, but with, and I'm sure David is familiar with this story. Trungpa, when he was studying in England at Cambridge University or Oxford, learning about Western culture, and it was during the 60s, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, etc., decided to, in order to reach Western students, which is, he saw that that's going to be his life work since he can't go back to Tibet, decided to take off his robes and start smoking cigarettes and drinking and sleeping with girls and women like the rest of the people were doing around him in the 60s. So it's like that's a move towards secularism. And later, you know, he used to wear suspenders and flannel shirts, but then later on when he introduced Shambhala Chinese later in his career, he started wearing suits and ties. So completely westernized because he felt like people would treat him like some kind of foreign object if he went around with the shaved head and the traditional robes that he grew up with.
Of course, Trungpa was with Akong, and Trungpa and Akong completely disagreed on this issue. Mm-hmm. And this is, in fact, why Trungpa went to, one of the major reasons why Trungpa went to America was because the two of them could not agree on how best to run things at Samyeling, which was and still is one of the largest Buddhist centers in Britain, where Akong ran things in a completely traditional Asian way. And I think each of them thought that the other's way was legitimate, but it wasn't their way. And so they split along these two lines, and rather amicably, I think, decided that one would run one center and the other would run a different center, because you can't do these two things together. And well, that's just a bit of history. Eventually, Akong, of course, died in Tibet. He had a number of social welfare projects there, and he met with an unfortunate event while looking after one of these projects. The question, why have things changed? Well, I guess one reason is we've all got older. In the 60s, as I recollect, nearly all my Buddhist friends, all my friends who were interested in Buddhism in Britain, I was in Cambridge at the time when Trungpa used to come often and lecture, and so did many other teachers. The audience was for the most part, under 30. Now, the average age of most Sanghas is some decades older than that. And there has been a trend towards secularism. There's also been a trend towards, what can we say, becoming respectable, making oneself a little bit more like the establishment. This has meant that there's been an Americanization, or we might say a Westernization, though I think some of my Buddhist teacher friends in Europe would want to dissent from being Americanized. But I think there is a quite serious danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. as we not so much import Buddhism as create something new that we call Buddhism, that's a projection of Western attitudes and the attitudes of a certain section of Western society, not even to say Western society as a whole, but a certain demographic within it. And maybe this is inevitable, but maybe it's not, I don't know, but it seems to be what's happened. We're in the West, we're concerned with certain questions that preoccupy us, and we tend to say, what does Buddhism say about that? But often they're not the questions that Buddhism was designed to answer. And so we finish up with something that's a bit of a new product, really.
You know, some time ago, I was studying with Robert Aiken in Hawaii, and I read a quote by Yamada Muban Roshi, in which he said, I'm paraphrasing, we need to find an original expression of Zen, but before we do, we have to make very sure that we understand what the original expression was. It was a caution against throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And if I look at my own journey, starting at 14 and reading the beat poets and hearing about Buddhism and assigning all these miraculous states to enlightenment, kind of like a Marvel comic superhero, and then gradually maturing and meeting Gary Snyder and actually getting to see a life that looked like a Buddhist life, or Paul Shippee, one of my earliest friends in California. I think maturity has something to do with it, but certainly in my own case, there's much of Zen that I still love and appreciate. I mean, my little Zendo has tatami mats. I have an altar. I sit every day and I do memorial ceremonies and do ancient dharanis and chants. But my cut of America is not so much an upper middle class cut. I'm interested in the people that I live with who are Mexican farm workers, who are retired people, who they come from a big cross section. And my impulse to translate things or secularize things is actually to democratize things. And much of what I think when I was young was like a kind of disguised Hinayana path. All I wanted was enlightenment, thinking about myself and what it would do. And as I got deeper and deeper into the implications of Mahayana, my practice had to change. And when I began to seriously consider the people I lived with, it makes perfect sense to me that Trungpa and Akon would respect each other but have different ways. And I wouldn't want to Americanize European practice of Buddhism, but I am trying to be a translator of what the Buddha's actual gifts were into American idioms.
Okay, I want to offer one sort of vision that I had quite a while ago about Buddhism coming into America. I've always been concerned about how it's happening. And it occurred to me that Buddhism I call this my flying saucer theory of Buddhism. And Buddhism is like a flying saucer originating from Buddha himself. It kind of can go over any country, Vietnam, Burma, Tibet, Japan, and now America. But nothing happens until the neurosis, if I might say so, of the people reach upward and bring their beings, their entire beings, their aspirations and their neuroses, whatever they have, their feelings, their needs, to bring it up to meet the flying saucer of Buddhism. And then I'm sort of speaking to a middle way between secular and non-secular. It's not either or, it's kind of in the middle. What I'm saying is that each culture brings its own manners and world outlook or personal neurosis or individualities or non-individualities in the case of Asia. So I think that that's how I felt comfortable for a long time now, seeing Buddhism as that kind of agent.
Well, there's one thing I'd like to throw in. It was from an email of David's, I think, who said, a white or Western Buddhism is a contradiction in terms. If Buddhism means a life of enlightenment, then there cannot be a specifically English or American Buddhism. We need to understand that when you look through Buddha eyes, England and America do not exist.
I think it's indisputable, but I think it's a both and situation, is that we don't live in a totally enlightened state all the time. We can't do it in the world while we have a form, while we have a body. So there's some kind of oscillation between a kind of individuated point of view and the holistic point of view that we sink into, or the formless point of view when we meditate. I wanted to ask David actually what he thought about something that's occurred to me in response to what Paul said, which is we can think of cultures and we can think of different ways of being, or we can think of the mind itself having different predilections and ways of being. So it seems that when the human mind itself looks at Buddha, there's a spectrum of the way he's looked at. For many people, he's a magical figure. He's not human. He came out of the side of his mother, or a white elephant, and there's all this mythic stuff that goes about it. And those people, and that point of view, are very comfortable with worship and exotic rituals. Then there are other people who may see it simply as a technology to throw them over a fence that separates what they imagine as enlightenment from everyday consciousness. And then there are other people who are thinking about, how is this teaching relevant to the world? And there are probably many more, but it seems to me that any and all of them can exist in any country, and that it's not a struggle to find the supremacy of one of them, but to recognize that they simultaneously exist. And I would be curious to hear from David, for instance, what led to his change from Zen practice to Amida practice, because I see that as a kind of shift of mind.
Yes, well, there's two different things here in a way. My own progress from one school of Buddhism to another is one thing. The general issue that you're raising, I think, is also an interesting question. I tend to think that Buddhism opens up or illumines or points to the nature of mind, if you like, and I mean that not in a sort of weird way. I mean that there has to be some fundamentals of the human mind, and that Buddhism accesses some of the deeper levels of the human mind. This is a kind of general idea. Why did I move from one school of Buddhism to another? Well, I started off in Cambridge, where we would get a teacher from a different school of Buddhism every week. So I didn't sort of didn't start off with a sense of just one school of Buddhism. Trungpa would come about once a month. We had a Burmese teacher teaching us samatha, and other teachers would come from other schools, including Zen teachers. And then Kenneth Roshi visited Britain, and I became involved with her. And she had recently returned from Japan, and she taught Zen. But most things in Japan are quite tinted with, colored by the Pure Land tradition. And certainly the way that Kenneth Roshi taught Zen had some aspects of that. So actually moving from Zen to Pure Land was not too difficult for me. It came rather naturally. And the element of, people often regard Pure Land as a more religious, less secular form of Buddhism. And that suits me quite well. I think that Buddhism is concerned with deep things that one might regard as metaphysical. These are the things that enable you to use a metaphor from my book, to contain the fire and direct it in wholesome ways. If you don't have that kind of depth, then you're really in the area of more sort of mundane psychology or even sociology. And at that level, of course, yes, you can have a whole variety coexisting. And it doesn't, there will be, as there are in all religions, there are everything from hermits to social activists and a great spectrum of different ways of applying the religion. And I've occupied several of those different slots during my time, but that's at a sort of level of social manifestation, whereas at the deeper level, I think there are things that most people would regard as metaphysical. And this, of course, is a problem because the West has a certain allergy for metaphysical things. I wrote a book called Not Everything is Impermanent. And when I show this book to people in the West, they look askance and say, but I thought Buddhism said everything is impermanent. Whereas if I show this book to people in Japan, they say, yes, of course, Nirvana is not impermanent, and that's what it's all about. And so there are two different perspectives here. And my own teacher, Kenneth Roshi, produced a book of translations of the Zen master Dogen. And she showed this book to her teacher, who was Japanese, of course. And he wanted the book to be called Zen is Eternal Life. And she realized that if it had this title, it would not sell a single copy in the West, despite the fact that this was the chosen title by one of the most senior Zen teachers in Japan. Eventually, the book came out called Selling Water by the River, which was much more palatable to Western taste. The West likes flowing rivers and likes to be in the flow of changeableness. But Buddhism ultimately is about having reference to what is not changeable. And so I think there are some contrasts certainly between Buddhism in the East and Buddhism in the West. Perhaps the East is closer to the original message. So these are just some of my thoughts at the moment, and some of the reason why I found it agreeable to shift. I mean, at a very practical level, there was a certain stage where my work was assisted by people from Pure Land schools from Japan, and that also affected my choice at a very humdrum, ordinary level. You go with your friends, but philosophically, it was not at all a difficult move for me to make.
David, how would you name what you consider to be unchangeable, and that you wrote a book about not everything in Buddhism is impermanent? How would you name what it is in Buddhism at this point in your life, having dipped into several, maybe a few different schools of Buddhism? How would you name for us, for people watching this, what you think is unchangeable, what you term as unchangeable in Buddhism?
Well, in Buddhism, there are many names for it. I've already said nirvana. You can say the Dharmakaya. You can say shunyata. There are many names in Buddhism for that which is unborn. The unborn is another name for it, the deathless. Buddhism has produced a whole range of words for that which, if you like, is eternal, that which is not subject to change. that which constitutes a true refuge. Most Western practitioners are not looking for a true refuge in this spiritual sense. They're looking for stress relief, improvement of their mundane lives, the solution of social problems, all sorts of things which are intrinsically good in themselves. But it's not really the heart of Buddhism. It's the use of elements taken from Buddhism and applied to social, psychological, personal issues. And I'm all for doing that too. You know, I'm very interested in Buddhism as psychology, the amelioration of social situations and personal problems and so on. Many of the Buddhist teachings can be applied in that way and very usefully, and a lot of my life's work has been on making those applications, how you can take the principles of the Abhidharma and turn them into psychotherapy, for instance. This, I think, is very laudable. But at the same time, I do have a sense that there is a deeper level that we tend not to touch at all.
I think that's really true. I think it's really interesting. And as you're talking, I think, well, and when I'm talking to other people, I'm seeking ways to explain that or talk about that. And I think one of the complexities is that particularly Americans are always looking for something to do. You know, what can I bloody well do? And we're, you know, it's like the wheel is spinning, but the gerbil has left. And when as you're talking, I'm realizing I've been using the word secular, but secular is not the word I mean. For instance, I find myself quite cranky about the way the corporate sector has attached itself to mindfulness, pulling it out of all compassionate practice and all spiritual parameters to make better widgets. So you know, Robert Creeley, a poet, once said, I got to use words when I talk to you. And I think one of the common problems that we all face as students and teachers is how to translate these things into language that will actually illuminate. There's a wonderful quote I read somewhere, I have in the frontispiece of one of my books, about a student who was challenged by his Japanese master to demonstrate his insight. And he said, if I open my mouth, I lie. If I don't speak, I'm a coward. And, you know, that's one response to the deathless, to the unborn, the unchanging. And so I'm wondering, maybe secular is the wrong tree to be climbing. Maybe there's some other, maybe secular itself confines us to a certain type of practice that leads us away from this deep center that David and Paul and me and Richard all recognize as invaluable.
Yeah, that's a good reflection on the word secular. When I first saw that word come up as a title, that's exactly what I felt. It was too confining.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the word secular originally meant and should mean a kind of tolerance of a wide range of views, but it's come to mean an intolerance of all religions.
I caught that today much more fully than I've been using it.
So it's gone through a transformation. Of course, mindfulness also gone through a transformation, because mindfulness has presented sort of modern utilitarian mindfulness is not really the mindfulness of the sutras. In a real sense, mindfulness in the sutras is to have your mind full of Dharma. It is to be filled with the Dharma. It's not about this moment intensive attention to whatever happens to be cropping up. And it is something that will, in fact, in a certain way, mindfulness is what's supposed to protect you against the present moment when something untoward might happen that carries you away. When my mother used the word mindful, when I was a child, before it had its modern connotation, and she said, "Now, David, when you go and see the neighbors, do be mindful of your manners." She meant when you walk in and you see the chocolate cake on the table, don't take the biggest slice. In other words, don't be, in Buddhist terms, don't be overwhelmed by greed, hate, and delusion in the immediate moment. Have something more enduring, some more enduring value that will hold you, will support you, will mean that you behave in a noble way, not like a little scallywag, as I was more inclined to. But that was the old-fashioned meaning of the word mindful, and that's why Rhys Davies chose it when he translated Sati and Smriti into English. In fact, there's a note in his translation where he says this is the equivalent of the Christian statement. Now, what is it? Whatsoever ye do, do it in my name. That the Christian is supposed to keep God in mind the whole time, and whatever he does it in the name of God. In Buddhism, you keep the Dharma in mind, and everything you do should be touched by that persistent awareness. And this was more the original meaning of mindfulness. But of course, it has gone through a transformation, an evolution. And the first stage of this was with Thich Nhat Hanh, who applied it to everything. He realized that Westerners were not going to be happy with keeping moral rules or precepts, so he called them mindfulness trainings. And soon everything was mindfulness. And then Kabat-Zinn came along and took that idea and applied it in the way that we all know about, and produced something that's really about, in Buddhist terms, is awareness rather than mindfulness, but and has its uses, but it's not quite what was meant originally.
So you just told a story that reminded me of something that kind of bridges a gap that's in our conversation. I used to take tea every week with Mitsu Suzuki, who was the widow of Suzuki Roshi. He had died by the time I came to Zen Center, and I felt this was as close to his wisdom as I was going to get. My wife was a tea ceremony student with her. And she and I liked each other, and she used to tease me terribly. So one day I was at tea, and she offered me a plate of tea sweets. There were different sized tea sweets. Yeah, there she is. Anyway, so I hesitated. I was looking at them, and I didn't want to take the biggest, and I didn't know exactly what to do. And she just shot out. She said, "Always closest, sometimes biggest, sometimes smallest." In other words, what struck me about it was she had taken the Dharma and turned it into a social practice to make you effective, to make you able to operate without thinking, without taking your mind off on contradictions and superficialities. And I think that may be the ghost in this conversation, that whatever our practice or whatever our understanding, we're looking for the translation of our feelings about Buddhism and the teachings into actual social action and interactions with other people. And I was always amazed by her because I never encountered a situation where she hadn't thought it through and reduced it to some simple practical thing, so she never had to take her mind off the interchange that was going on between her and the person in the room.
Nice.
Well, Speaking of feelings, there's another question that might be interesting to ask. This one's first for Paul, and it's about nonviolent communication. And Paul's been studying Zen and Tibetan meditation for decades, but now you're also practicing and teaching nonviolent communication that was developed by Marshall Rosenberg. And you seem to be finding reasons for introducing and integrating the emotional awareness and wisdom of NVC into the developing arc of Western Buddhism. What are your reasons?
Well, for decades, I have been associated with various sanghas, and I always have a common experience that the people and the atmosphere is devoid of warmth and feeling and meaningful emotional connections between each other. And as I say that, for example, the 16th Karmapa, when he came to Boulder, we hosted him in grand Tibetan style. But before he left, he made a comment about, where's the warmth in this community? So I have starved for that warmth all my life. I'll give you one example. When my son was 6 years old, he was hit by a car and he was nearly killed. And he was in a coma for about 3 days, which qualified as a major head injury. And then he didn't speak for a month or so. But when he was in the hospital, his head bandaged up like a balloon, and the pressure in his brain was monitored by the screen above. I was there. I had come up from southern Colorado, where I'd been living in the Huerfano Valley, and I came up to Boulder to the hospital, and I stayed in the hospital for a few days. And guess who? I had almost no money, and I had no place to live. I had been living with my girlfriend in Gardner, Colorado, and guess who came across with food and place to live? It wasn't the Buddhists. The Buddhists stood around with looking like deer in the headlights. The people that came forward with the warmth and the generosity were not Buddhists. They were the mother and fathers of my son's playmates. Ordinary people, never heard of Buddhism. They showed way more compassion than my Buddha mates in Boulder. That was my first hit to wake up to what I had been noticing for a long time, was the lack of warmth and the lack of meaningful emotional exchange between Buddhists. But I don't want to just say Buddhist, because that's typical of the culture. And some of the most troubled people in the culture would come into Buddhism, and then they would act out that frozen emotional quality and turn it into hierarchy and dominance and competition. And sanghas are way dysfunctional. We've had incredible implosions. Sogya Rinpoche, Katagiri Roshi, Richard Baker, all these, Sakyong Mipam, the head of the Shambhala after Trungpa died. So within this dysfunction, there's also this quality of how can I find some kind of warmth in my life, which was started out in the family of origin. Emotions were not on the table, period. I'm sorry. Emotions were not on the table. And I admit that about my family, and a lot of people won't want to admit that even about themselves, but a lot of people will. Almost everybody I tell this story to, they really understand. They shake their head. Nobody contradicts me, actually, when I talk about the lack of emotional warmth in Buddhist sanghas or in corporations. Google, for example, hired a team of psychologists to come in and evaluate the teams who were not being as productive as they ought to be. And after a year and a half and $250,000, the advice was to the team people who were working at Google, hey, it's okay to feel and to say what you feel. That was the result. These grown-up people needed to hear that. So I was in this milieu, so to speak, wondering what to do about it. And when my son when I was still with my son in the hospital, a doctor friend of mine said, Paul, why don't you go to the 12-step meeting that's in the Sacred Heart Auditorium on Wednesday night at 6 o'clock. So I walked in there, and as soon as I walked in that room, there were 60 people sitting in a circle. It was an adult children of alcoholics meeting. I saw instantly, and as soon as people started talking, that these people knew what suffering was. And the Buddhists that I was part of in a community did not know what suffering was, afraid to face real suffering. So these people with parents who were alcoholics and abusive and suffering themselves from addictions were able to talk openly and cleanly about suffering. And I said, holy cow, this is what Buddhism is about. And these people are not even Buddhists, and they're really open about it. Then the next, so that was one little thing that gave me an alternative. When Buddhist friends asked me, why do you go to 12-step meetings? I would say, well, I never had a substance problem. I never was addicted. I never had to give anything up. But I'm going because of grief, and there's no other place in America that I can process grief, except by hiring somebody. So in this large circle, I found secular Buddhism. And so the next thing that happened was that I stumbled on an article and then a radio interview on New Dimensions Radio. Marshall Rosenberg was being interviewed by Michael Toms, and my mouth just fell open. I said, this is the missing piece. This is what we need in Buddhist Sanghas, is what this man is teaching, which is how to bring out the best in us, which is natural compassion. And here are the tools to do it. You make an observation, you tell what you feel, and you tell what the need is that's causing the feeling, and then you make a request of how can will make life more wonderful. And why don't Buddhists do that? I've taught this at many Buddhist Sanghas all over the country, and even in Spain. And people are largely receptive, but what I find is that with feelings in the culture in general, wherever I go, people, even in the workshops I do, people's attitude toward feelings is something like, you pick up the sense that people think that feelings are private, that you're not supposed to take the big chocolate first by telling what your feelings are. You hold back and you take the small one. And you really, feelings are like a foreign country. And needs, I've had criticism from Buddhists that needs are ego. So we have a long ways to go to integrate feelings and needs, which are the low-hanging fruit in the human interchange, that we can easily access them, and they make for wonderful quality of connection, which is actually the purpose of nonviolent communication, is to create quality of connection, something I almost never experienced in Buddhist Sanghas. Now, I've one friend here and there, maybe I could, but in general, as a group, so I'm so thankful that I can weave in this human qualities of feelings and needs, identifying and expressing them, not make them solid, not trying to put out your ego manifestations in new clothes, but just simply, honestly, what are you feeling in this moment, and what are you needing, and what would you, how can you request what you need from another person based on simple, honest. I think this whole thing, to wrap this up, I think this whole thing started in the Enlightenment 400 years ago with Descartes and those people talking about, I think, therefore I am. And we went up into the head and we created industrial civilization, and feelings got left behind. I have a feeling that as simple as that. So I'd like to hear other people's comments about that.
Well, I've always thought about it the same way, going back to the Industrial Revolution, but I also think about it as explaining something of the reasons why women are oppressed and ignored and disregarded, because, you know, men like quantifiable events. They like computers, they like engines, they like to talk about CCs and quantifiable things. And women are skilled in the realms of feeling. And I was amazed that when I took your class, what a terrible nonviolent communication student I was. After 50 years of working as a Buddhist, I know that I'm a PTSD survivor from a family like yours, where not only were feelings not acknowledged, but nobody's feelings but my father's were admitted into conversations. And so I just learned how to operate in my head very often and would take days to find out what I was feeling. But I think that that's a locus of real, that was my exact problem with Zen Center, for instance. You'd knock on the door and someone would say, "May I help you?" And it was about as warm as a morgue. And that's not what I was looking for. And so as I've gotten older, I've tried to really translate things into give people permission and give myself permission to really express feelings. And I was helped a great deal by the nonviolent communication class in taking kind of baby steps to do that. So I think it's a great contribution.
Of course, some of these concern about this issue was in the background of me writing the Feeling Buddha book, and asserting that the Buddha was a person of feelings, not just a sort of cognitive machine. My sense of the Buddha is of a person with the whole range of what it is to be fully human, a person of love. And certainly in the Sanghas that I've had much to do with in the last several decades anyway, feelings are very much expressed. But I understand the problem that you're talking about. I have encountered it sometimes in some situations. I can remember being at a temple where a significant teacher had recently died, and I did have the impression that everybody was doing their darndest not to grieve, which seemed to me completely inappropriate. But there we are. But people certainly have a great range of feelings, thoughts, imaginations, the whole works. And being liberated surely means the employment of all those dimensions.
Well, you helped me really understand something in that area by just clearly explicating the two words noble truth. True means, if it means anything, it means real. And noble means worthy of respect and dignity. And I started thinking about it, and I began to review my times in Zen communities. And I sort of realized that maybe one of the reasons people were afraid to acknowledge problems or strong feelings was it might be misunderstood as evidence of their spiritual dysfunction or their fall from enlightenment. And right. I thought, oh my God, it's like a mass neurosis. If we listen to Buddha and he tells us dukkha is real, samudaya is real. It's there. It's not a product of your willfulness or your ignorance. And I found that so useful in talking to people and in even monitoring my own permissions that I give myself to be fully expressive. I can't believe that I was almost 80 years old before I saw an explanation that practical and simple and workable.
Because after I published the Feeling Buddha book, a couple of years later, I was at a conference in London in which various things were being discussed, but there were linguists and philologists there. And one of them presented a paper that argued convincingly that the Four Noble Truths is not a very good translation, that it should be Four Truths, Four Noble Ones. And this rather confirmed the thesis that I put in my book. because it implies that dukkha is a truth for noble ones, samudaya is a truth for noble ones, nirodha and marga also. And this has led me to now view the Four Truths as, like, the first two truths are truths for everybody. And enlightened people experience dukkha, and they have reactions to it, which include a whole range of emotions, feelings. But the question is then, what do you do with that? And if you do certain things, then you finish up on the Eightfold Path. If you do other things, you just make more dukkha for yourself and everybody else.
Here.
So this seems like a reasonable interpretation to me of what the Buddha was trying to say. Of course, one can never know for sure, but it seems in line with how I understand the whole range of Buddhist texts.
David, one of the things I really liked about your book, The Feeling Buddha, is your sort of scholarly look deeply into Sanskrit. For example, analyzing the word nirodha, which is often in my Sangha and the Nalanda Translation Committee insists, and I called them up and asked them about this, they insist that it means cessation, which means the elimination of suffering, period, connected with enlightenment. But I love the way you sort of took it apart and began to see it as, and by the way, the autobiography of a yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda, also took that word apart. Nirodha said it meant control, could mean control, could mean different things. But I like the way you brought out this sense that it's like a wall that you could build to keep the wind from blowing the fire out. You can manage suffering and you can protect yourself and ameliorate it, but you're probably not going to make it completely go away. So the digging into the origin of the Sanskrit word nirodha was very nicely put, and I enjoyed quite a lot.
Well, I have a fascination with words. When I think I was about 10 years old when my mother bought me an etymological dictionary, and it became one of my prized possessions. But it can be a rather irritating habit that I'm always taking words apart, but it can also be illuminating sometimes.
I have to tell you a funny story because I think it's largely cultural. I would say class for class, the English vocabulary is about 30% larger than the American vocabulary. I was once in London with a woman who grew up in Ohio, kind of like hillbilly country. And we were taking a cab from a hotel down to Covent Gardens, and it was a great traffic jam. And she was talking and talking and talking. And after about 20 minutes, she looked up and she said, "Is this all the further we've got?" And the cab driver turned around and he said, "Madam, that's not speaking. That's stringing words together." And I looked over the front seat, and this East End Cockney had the collected works of Shakespeare in his front seat for when he's sitting around. So I thought, oh yeah, that's what a culture does.
Okay, well, you came back to America after that?
I what?
You came back to America after that?
Yeah, well, I was working in England. But, you know, I'm a wordsmith. We're all wordsmiths, actually. I mean, we all love language.
Well, we could go off on some amusing tangents that wouldn't help the discussion.
Well, in that case, maybe we'll move on to what might be the last question, and it concerns, the subject concerns engaged Buddhism, whatever that means, which is always a tricky one. So in the email exchange leading up to this, Peter put out a question that I'll read. What are the political implications of the Buddha's teachings? More specifically, doesn't enlightened action imply and require addressing political threats, economic inequities, and repression? I believe it does, and I believe that implicit in Buddhist practice is a responsibility to the larger Sangha of the country and culture where you live. This is quite different than the nationalism David rightly warns about, but rather implies addressing engagement in vernacular terms to the people with whom you live.
Well, I'm thinking it's a good question. And I totally agree with when Peter put that email out, that one of the, not precepts, but one of the ideals of Buddhism, besides compassion and wisdom, is to relate to the world from the point of view of, as Suzuki Roshi said, things as it is, or relate to the world as what is, and relate to the world as what is, and things as they are, rather than how we want them to be. Originally, my daughter one time pointed out to me, who's a Buddhist, that she understands and found out that, discovered that the cause of your suffering is wanting things to be different than they are. And I think that in Buddhism, there's a tendency, in all spirituality, there's a tendency perhaps to withdraw from worldly concerns, especially in the Hindu, way I understand Hinduism. But there's a tendency, and that translated down into psychology is something that my friend John Wellwood termed spiritual bypassing, which is the fact that you seek the God realm and comfort and good feelings as a definition of spirituality. You're supposed to feel good, but you don't. So therefore, that takes you away from paying attention to what's really happening in the culture, such as the climate crisis and the destruction of environment and the reduction of biodiversity and forest burning and the collapse of the biosphere. I mean, we are on the edge of survival right now, and the threat of survival. And China has now come up with hypersonic weapons that can go around the world in 5 times the speed of sound. It's getting pretty scary out there. And with the COVID and the destruction of forests and you know, I think Buddhism should be, or the call is to lean into the sharp points of how the world is falling apart in terms of politically and environmentally and in so many other ways, relationships and divorce and blah blah. It's necessary for Buddhists to pay attention. Isn't that what mindfulness means? And so, including political things and environmental destruction, and asking why it seems that we're not as smart as we think we are as terms of a culture. We're following our nest and threatening the destruction of a human life itself. If that isn't a concern of Buddhism, well, each person as a Buddhist needs to pick their own path, but I would advocate that and think that it's a Buddhist responsibility to go along, think the way Peter does, which is get engaged. Thich Nhat Hanh was a big fan of this. So between turning away from worldliness and engaged Buddhism is a huge gamut of reactions and engagement that Buddhists can have. So I don't know how to call, I'm not a powerful person who can call Buddhists to action, but Thich Nhat Hanh was, and I studied with him for a long time and learned his. So, Peter, you could speak to this. I mean, you've been engaged before you were Buddhism for a long time. So I think that this tendency to withdraw from the world might be okay for a while until you solve some inner strife. But at some point you have to come back to the marketplace and deal with the farmers and the laborers and the people who make things happen, the farmers especially.
In my own life, I would say that the feelings that drew me to political action are precisely identical to the feelings that drew me to Buddhism. And they were empathy and compassion and actually love of the variety of the world, love of what the formless extrudes over and over again. I mean, the miraculousness of a housefly. I've watched a little housefly on the tip of my fingers, scrubbing its little feet, washing its little face. I mean, I have no idea why the universe produced this, why formlessness generated this, but it's beautiful. And so for a long time, I was very angry, and I thought there were good guys and there were bad guys. And then by studying Buddhism, I realized, oh no, I was a human being, and I was as dangerous as the worst of them out there if I let myself, get too far off the leash. And the leash was remembering that there's a common source to everything, and that the person that I most despise was generated by the same universe that generated me. So if I can't identify a fixed self in myself, I can't identify a fixed self in another person. I can't say he's evil. That's a fixed, graspable quality. All I can say is, what are the experiences that led him or her to think this way and behave this way? And it sounds ineffectual, but what I learned from a life in politics and political practice is that when you drop judgment and you just face people with honest curiosity, something relaxes in them and they stop being defensive and the conversation drops into a different level. And it's probably, it feels very weak and ineffectual next to the Republicans trying to replace all the secretaries of state and be able to alter the vote. But nobody backslides from Buddhist insight. When you have a little wake-up call or when you have some kind of revelation, your life is permanently altered. And so you don't have to worry about that person again. And there's something about the modeling of behavior that inspires other people to pick it up and model it. And that's how we move through time. So the best thing that I've learned in my practice is I have the same impulse to help people or solve problems, but I realize I cannot do it with force and I can't do it with judgment and with brutality. And I am alarmingly brutal and murderous in my imagination. It's been a struggle my entire life. I mean, I still wake up in the mornings imagining I'm running the CIA and saying, okay, we're going to do a little wet work today. We're going to disguise it as a mugging. But today I want you to kill Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh, Mitch McConnell, and Congressman Hawley. And then next week we'll pick another, that's the house I grew up in. That's the mind I grew up with. But I know that it doesn't work. And so it's Buddhism that gives me the ballast and the connection to the formless, to the deathless, that gives me the understanding that when I meet my opponent, I'm meeting myself, and I have to give him the respect that the universe gave him by creating him. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but so that's where I am today. I'm still doing the same political work, still concerned with the two great existential issues, which are nuclear weapons and global warming. I mean, the fact that they're taboo to talk about seems to me insane, but I keep talking about them, and I don't know, we may not make it, but that's not exactly my concern either. I can only be concerned with my effort and my consistency, and hopefully that if I express myself as a good model, other people will copy it.
Well said.
Well, I would say, firstly, Buddhism does advocate a simpler life, a life more in tune with nature, a life that is relatively freer of greed, of hatred, of pride, delusion. These are all kind of Buddhist fundamentals. So there is a manifesto there, if you like, if you want to sort of tease it out. In I think it is can be considered noble action. We're talking about noble truths. I think it's noble action to resist oppression, to assist the afflicted, and to demonstrate an alternative. Often in practice, you have to choose between these. But they're all good. They're all noble actions, and so there's many areas where Buddhists can be, and those with similar values who are not Buddhists can be nobly engaged. Rather in line with some of the things that Peter was just saying, in Pure Land Buddhism, there is a great emphasis upon the fact that we're all deluded. Or to put it in more simple language, we're all foolish beings. We're all prone to error, we're all vulnerable. We're not always right about everything, we're not always virtuous, we don't always do our best, and so on. And so there is an important aspect of practice, which is becoming aware of this in one's own case, because that is really the foundation of compassion. It enables you to understand others if you've seen this truth in yourself. Thinking of the actual world situation at the moment, well, I guess there's far too many of us. The human population has grown and grown, so that there's hardly any kind of wilderness left in many countries, especially in crowded countries in Europe. I've just come from Netherlands. 18 million people living on a bit of land, most of which is below sea level and scheduled to disappear in the near future. The forward prospect does not look terribly good. The ecological crisis, of course, we're all preoccupied with the pandemic at the moment, which I suppose is one aspect of the ecological crisis, but more generally, the ecological problem is such that conditions for humans are going to get worse for the foreseeable future, certainly for the rest of my lifetime, probably for the next 40 or 50 years on present predictions, maybe much longer. So there's also an aspect of can Buddhism help people to adapt to the dark times that are coming? And this, I think, is a very important question. There have been dark ages before, and sometimes it has been religious communities that have preserved something of civilization and culture through such dark times. I don't know if it'll get as bad as that, but it might. And certainly as Buddhists, we should be thinking about how we consistently live good, demonstrate an alternative, live good community lives for the sake of everybody, not just ourselves.
And that we've gone over an hour there. Want to wrap it up, or?
I think it's a good place to stop.
Yeah. So does anybody?
I wanted to just offer a translation of compassion back into Tibetan. And compassion means noble heart in the Tibetan language. I've heard that, and I was completely uplifted by that, the Tibetan take on wherever that word compassion came from or what it meant. They like to say noble heart instead of the word compassion.
Well, we could finish on noble-heartedness.
That sounds great. Well,
Sounds good to me.
well, I really thanks to the three of you for doing this because, you know, what can I say? So thanks to you. I'd like to thank Ruby Lee also for technical help because I'd be lost without her. And any final words?
Yes, I'd like to thank you for being perseverant in organizing this. It's like washing and waxing a cat to get the three of us together.
Wow.
And it wouldn't have happened without your efforts. Thank you so much.
Well,
And I'd like to thank you also, Richard, for the conceiving of the idea of bringing us all three together.
but it was really obvious to me that it had to happen. So, all right.
Well, I suppose my final word would be that I hope we stay connected in some way.
Where do you live in Paris, in France, David?
I live deep in the countryside. I'm very much in retreat at the moment.
Uh-huh.
And, I'm miles from anywhere. You won't even find me in the guidebooks.
Well, that seems like a sanity protector. I only asked because I'm overdue. I've spent a lot of time in France and I'm overdue to return. I'm actually homesick. And I thought we might have had a cuppa if I did that.
Indeed. I'm about 3 hours from Paris. But yes, keep in touch and we'll see what.
Thank you so much.
Fortunately, I live on a not very high, but a small hill. So if France completely goes underwater, I shall still be a small island.
Great.
Richard, dare I end on a joke?
Yeah, of course.
Well, this is a story. You know, my background is Jewish, but we could translate it for Buddhist in this case. But there's an accident in the computer systems of the nuclear world, and Putin called Joe Biden to say there's been a terrible disaster. All of our missiles are going to the United States, and the United States has been triggered in return, and in 1 hour the world will be underwater. It's very important to call the religious leaders together. So they call the Pope, and the Pope calls all the Catholics, and he makes an announcement, and he says, it's a terrible thing. In 45 minutes, the world will be underwater. And we Catholics, we have a great deal of work to do. We must make confession. We must prepare to meet our God. And in Oklahoma, Billy Graham calls all the Protestants together, and he says, oh, this is just a terrible thing that's going to happen in 30 minutes. The world is going to be underwater and looks like the end, and we've got to repent, and we've got to prepare that this is it. We're going to meet God finally. We're going to the chosen land. And in the Lower East Side of New York, there's a tiny little Jewish shul, and the rabbi is talking. And he's saying, well, it's a terrible thing. The world in 15 minutes is going to be underwater. And the Pope, he's called all the Catholics, and they're doing what they do. They got a lot of stuff to do. And Mr. Graham, he's called all the Protestants together. They doing what they do. 15 minutes left. And we Jews, we gotta do a lot of stuff too, because in 15 minutes, the world's gonna be underwater. So first, we have to learn to live underwater.
I have a joke. I'll end with a joke also, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
There's a man standing there talking like this. I, yes, very much like to be in the present moment, but not this present moment. How about a beach present moment?
You know, I said that once to my teacher when I was getting ordained as a priest, and I was in somewhere, and I said, listen, aren't people suffering in Beverly Hills? Couldn't I go there to help? It's not exactly a joke, Paul.
Thank you, David, for all your writing and especially that book, The Feeling Buddha. Even though it's been out for a long time, it's still turning a lot of people on to new perspectives on feelings in Buddhism.
Thank you all.
Okay.